I recently caught wind of a new Netflix show titled Sense8, and that's spelled Sense8, the number 8. Now, I'm roughly halfway through the second episode, and, I don't really know what to make of it on my first impression. There are some moments when there's interesting, believable dialogue, and then other moments when it's cheesy and lame. And all I know from watching it thus far is that it follows 8 strangers dispersed throughout the world who are somehow linked telepathically in an as-of-yet unexplained way. The increasingly popular hallucinogenic DMT, which I've mentioned in previous videos, is mentioned briefly, and I suppose that somehow this substance is going to be used to explain the linking of the minds of these separate individuals. And on this premise alone, given my fascination with Gaspar Noé's, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but Gaspar Noé's psychedelic masterpiece, Enter the Void, the series then warrants at least a preliminary watch. I'm going to give it a few more episodes and see if it pans out. There are a lot of diverse characters in this show, and I don't mind diverse characters. It's interesting to see people from different backgrounds. It keeps things interesting at times, and it seems like Sense8 is going to be treating the viewer to the increasingly common utilization of backstory cinema a la Lost or Orange is the New Black, where the story is continuously progressing in time, but also takes the occasional foray into a character's past in order to eventually explain current events in the progressing storyline. At times, though, it comes off as it's trying a little bit too hard and selling us a healthy dose of, we are the world diversity. Diversity works, after all, when it's voluntary, and not when it's rammed down our throats in typical social justice warrior fashion. And this is what, at times, seems to happen in this series. Now, it's also early in the series, and I haven't had enough time to suitably assess Sense8. This is just my first impression. So, then, gentlemen, you're going to have to pardon my ignorance on all things gender fluid. I am, after all, mere cis scum, and male at that, but I assure you, I have checked the shit out of my privilege and flogged myself repeatedly in hopes of gaining understanding of such matters. There is the issue of 2 characters in the show. The characters Nomi Marks, a male-to-female transgender woman played by Jamie Clayton, and her girlfriend Amanita, played by the actress Freema. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Eigman, I believe it is. But anyway, sex scenes abound in the Sense8 universe, and these 2 star-crossed lovers are introduced to us in the midst of a strap-on sex scene, after which a flashback gives us a glimpse into a day in their lives at a local annual gay pride parade. So, Amanita introduces her transgender girlfriend to a group of lesbian feminists. She is received not as a friend or as an ally, as one would expect in the moral, compassionate, tolerant world of lesbian feminism, but instead as an enemy, a testosterone-infused usurper of the cause. And I'm going to put a screen cap, because it really says it all. I'm going to put a screen cap directly from the Netflix episode here, so you can see that. And so she introduces them, and they're basically like, "Oh, you're the tranny that blogs about politics, right? How compassionate, how tolerant, right? My cis scum ears and eyes may be deceiving me, right, causing this act of tolerance and compassion to be perceived negatively on my part, but this does look a bit like bigotry, doesn't it? That catch-all phrase that feminists constantly hurl at men. Well, I'm going to let you decide by giving you a play-by-play summary of the entire exchange here. Now, again, in the screen cap, we see Nomi and Anamita, and Anamita introduces Nomi to these lesbian feminists. Amanita says, "Hey, y'all, this is the one I've been talking about," as she introduces Nomi. Then the lesbian feminist, pictured here with the blue bandana, I'm going to call her lesbian feminist 1, says, "Wait, I know you. You're the tranny that blogs about politics. I totally disagree with what you said about dropping LGBT. A second lesbian feminist, she's the one with the tattoos and the plaid shirt here, tells her to relax. "Come on, relax, it's a party," she says. The blue bandana lesbian feminist 1 says, "We fought hard for that recognition." Then Nomi chimes in and she says, "I just thought that the distinctions were separating us." And again, back to the lesbian feminist with the blue bandana, lesbian feminist number 1. She basically says, "Bullshit, quote, bullshit, you're just another colonizing male trying to take up any space left to women." Incredible that this gets broadcast when women are literally moving in on every fucking male space available. But whatever, right? This, gentlemen, is why I do not get mad at feminism, but I simply seek to understand it. And by all accounts, Feminism seems to be a movement driven not by any explicit hatred, although it may seem that way at times, but not by any explicit hatred, not even of men, but instead by female supremacism and the acquisition of positions of privilege for the female sex at the expense of others, especially men. Their veneer of tolerance is a facade, plain and simple. Feminists use the gay rights movement when it suits them, they ally with gay men when it suits them, and they make nice with the trans community when it suits them, but make no mistake about it, feminism exists as a means of perpetuating gynocentrism, and men, having all those pesky androgens in their physiology, have no real place in that operation. This goes for gay men, and this also applies to male-to-female trans women. Male-to-female trans women, despite the fact that they appear female or that they identify as female, are still born with the call of the Y chromosome. They will never have a place in feminist discourse. They are, according to feminists, much like David Futrell, curious token sideshow exhibits in the feminist circus. Make no mistake, however, feminists and women are the ringleaders in this operation. Now, this being a fictional show, I will without a doubt be accused of embellishment and asked to show real-world examples of how feminists display these attitudes towards men, so I'm going to take the opportunity here to do just that. The following article is titled, quote, How the Hypersexual Trans Movement Hurts Feminism, and boy, is it replete with hypocrisy. Now, it starts off by saying, quote, A central theme of modern or third-wave feminism is that women should not be treated merely as sexual objects. A central theme of the trans movement is the presentation of trans women as hypersexual objects. Feminism is not big enough for both of these themes. Either being a woman is essentially defined as being alluring to men, or it isn't. Either the Playboy bunny defines the essence of womanhood, or it doesn't. At the moment, the trans movement opposes more than a century of feminism on this point. Third-wave feminists, in their eagerness to be allies, have abandoned this basic tenet. It must be reclaimed. And then the article continues further down and says, quote, How have we arrived at a point in which feminists fundamentally alter their definition of womanhood to accommodate men? Last year, Laverne Cox, this is the transgender actor in the series, the popular Netflix series Orange is the New Black, Laverne Cox became the first trans woman on the cover of Time magazine. It was a glamour shot, a slinky blue dress, long blonde hair, and a come-hither look. Not to be outdone, the former Bruce Jenner introduced his new gender to the world this week on the cover of Vanity Fair in a bit of white lingerie, also with that come-hither look. Should feminists really be chanting, quote, This is what a real woman looks like, end quote, are we sure? What exactly does a trans woman think it means to feel like a woman? When a person identifies as a female, what is being defined as female? Is it the breasts, lips, ass, slim waist, small hands, batting eyelashes, flirtatious smile, long hair, fingernail polish, eyeliner, yada yada, she goes on and on forever. And then she says, a want to be taken care of, a want to be adorned and catcalled? Is there some feeling inherent to the placement of ovaries other than monthly cramps and bleeding that can be attributed to a feeling of femaleness? These supposed and stereotypical traits, while traditionally identified as feminism, are not innate to females, as the trans movement shows us. Men can feel feminine too. Women can feel masculine. These societally defined traits of sex do not define a sex. Feminists have been fighting for decades since the suffragettes to vocalize the non-feminineness of females. We can vote, we can fight, that's a good one, we can wear pants and flats, we can boss a whole room of employees without demurring. To allow the trans movement to objectify women is to accept the oppression of the female sex by the male sex and to further accept male definitions of what it is to be female, end quote. So, gentlemen, the hypocrisy here is mind-boggling, isn't it? Feminists, the author claims, have fought long and hard to vocalize the, quote, non-feminineness of females, but also don't like it when someone like Bruce/Caitlyn Jenner emulates the feminineness that feminists have fought so hard to distance themselves from. Now again, I'm just cis scum here, oppressing everybody with my heterosexuality and all that, but, methinks that it's possible that these women know very well the advantages that women can and do garner by leveraging their sexuality, and they don't want a filthy man getting in on that action. Now, personally, I like women, right? I like the female form, and I don't think that the things that make women physically attractive can be, at this point, simulated via plastic surgery or hormone therapy convincingly, given the current state of medical science. But, this isn't about me. This is about men as a whole. And you know what? Some men do actually find transgendered male to female individuals attractive. Perhaps, even more so than the opposite sex. Could that be what the author is worried about here? Now, I guess that it's a good time as any, since I'm talking about it already here, to give my humble opinion on transgendered folks, transgendered people, etc. Frankly, I don't really understand what the big deal is about these people. I tend to view them as I view all other human beings, as people reacting to environmental pressures, nothing more, nothing less. But, in the last few months, given the fact that a high-profile celebrity, Caitlyn or Bruce Jenner, has made this male-to-female transition, this is going to be receiving an unprecedented amount of attention and dialogue. Now, I know this will infuriate some, but I do want to make the distinction that Bruce or Caitlyn Jenner is not, in any true sense, a woman. I am a transhumanist. I believe that in the future, we will be able to develop the surgical means to install the genitalia of either sex into a person of the opposite sex. I believe that we will combine this with forms of gene and hormonal therapy that will change someone's gender in a way that, for all intents and purposes, this person will essentially become that gender. I believe that in the far, far future, it may be even possible to change a man to a woman or vice versa on the chromosomal level. And as a transhumanist who believes that all people should be free to use technology to augment or improve themselves in whichever way they see fit, I see nothing wrong with this. With all of that said, we cannot ignore the fact that in every way that modern science defines gender apart from, his mental state, Jenner is still in all ways a man. He still has a penis. He still has an XY chromosome written into his DNA. He is a man who has undergone facial feminization surgery, a tracheal shave, breast augmentation, and other cosmetic procedures in order to appear more feminine. He is a member of the male sex. That is a fact. How he identifies mentally here is what's really up for debate. It is human nature, I think, whether the person expressing it is male or female, to want to belong on some level. Human beings crave acceptance from other human beings. That's simply what we do. There comes a point, though, in the pursuance of that acceptance, however, where one is compromising so much of their identity and what they believe makes them them, that the acceptance of others simply is not worth it to them. When this happens, the person who sacrificed his acceptance usually has a strong desire to express to society in a visible way the reasons why they rejected society's acceptance in the first place. Now, perhaps this is some kind of attempt at bringing others who feel alienated for the same reasons into the fold along with them. It's an attempt maybe to start a community of the like-minded. And maybe it's also some kind of subconscious admission that the outcast still does in fact crave the acceptance of society, or maybe it's a combination of all of these things. But I do believe that a person like Jenner is not willing to go to such great lengths, including, risky surgeries, social ostracization from many elements in society, and a lot of other things if he didn't really feel that he had a damned good reason for doing so. I think that Jenner, in taking such extreme action, must be an individual that feels so stifled in his male body that he needs out and is willing to take drastic action to do so. He doesn't seem to be comfortable in his own skin, so he changed it at great social and financial cost to himself, I'm sure. And that's really all that I have to say about Jenner, that he should be free to change his body in any way he sees fit, if he truly feels this stifled by the body he was born with. I do not pretend to know what type of psychological dynamics causes someone to seek out such a radical transformation, and frankly, I don't very much care. If this is what makes Jenner happy, we live in a free country. He should be able to do as he pleases. But, with all of that said, I believe that feminists, and indeed not just feminists, but, many everyday women, as well as traditionalist conservative moral posturizers, would disagree. Feminists do not like Caitlyn Jenner / Bruce Jenner because although, according to them, women should, quote, move away from their femininity, men like Caitlyn Jenner better damn well stay away from it, just in case they ever want it back. And traditionalist conservatives don't like Caitlyn Jenner because their gynocentric, Abrahamic patriarchs in the sky told them to, amongst other reasons. As we all know, tradcons tend to worship women. They don't want a, quote, woman-like man getting in the way of that protecting and providing. The fact that men like Jenner are now emulating female physical beauty, right, at least attempting to emulate it, I don't think they're very convincing in my opinion, shows the tradcon that, you know, his fantasy, his worship of the female form is cheap. She is a false god, and modern science is beginning to recreate the venerated Aphrodite on a male canvas. Jenner shows them that there is nothing special about female beauty. It's not worth providing for, it's not worth protecting, and it doesn't make you a, quote, real man if you do, and tradcons fear this tremendously. The article continues on and says, quote, "The problem here is how Annie Leibovitz and Vanity Fair set about showing us that Jenner is truly a woman. They did it by painting precisely the pinup we teach our daughters to reject as their central aspiration. The sexual objectification of trans women is used as proof of their womanness, but the sexual objectification of non-trans women is considered demeaning because it associates their primary worth in relation to male desire. Being oppressed by men is being oppressed by men, even if those men are wearing dresses." End quote. You know, these people, they lack the ability to be content, right? No matter what is done to try to satiate these toxic little people, it will never be enough. And this is why we should never give them an inch. Because anything that we give these people will immediately be thrown into their grievance meat grinder, and as soon as they stuff whatever you give them into their miserable little gullets, they'll demand more and curse you for giving it to them. They don't want to be sexually objectified, but then they do want to be sexually objectified. Or at least they don't want anyone else to actually enjoy the harmless, trivial shit that they deem objectification. The article continues and say, "These carpetbaggers to womanhood are trying to prove to all of us what it really means to be a woman is to pose in a Playboy bunny outfit and make kissy faces at men. They reinforce this idea to teenage girls. Go put on a miniskirt, honey, celebrate Jenner's beauty, and try to exemplify it in your own life. Make sure the boys think you're pretty, and also make sure to recognize and check your privilege as a person whose womanhood, unlike Jenner's, is never questioned. You don't even have to fight for it." End quote. So, basically, me, and more of me, right? Finally, we start to see a picture begin to emerge here. Trans men, or trans women, you know what I'm referring to here. I mean, the fucking syntax is so confusing sometimes. But trans women, or trans men who wish to emulate women, are, quote, carpetbaggers. The real problem here is that men are, according to these feminists, infringing on women's turf. They don't like that a man dare attempt to look feminine, and they don't like that girls are possibly urged to please men with Jenner as an unlikely and ironic catalyst. Now, in a way, frankly, I'm glad all of this is happening. I'm glad that the poisoned well of social justice warrior grievance politics has become so toxic that skirmishes are starting to break out between their various factions. Cracks are starting to show. And perhaps now the dam is, about to burst. Only time will tell. But, either way, it's great fun to watch, isn't it? Take, for instance, this article titled, quote, "MSNBC Insanity. Abortion language excludes transgenders. Women now politically incorrect term." And I've embedded the video to this in the blog post that I wrote about this, and both of these blog posts, it's a compilation of two of them, are going to be in the description box if you want to check it out for yourselves. But I also want to read to you a brief excerpt from the article. It says, quote, "An MSNBC panel agreed earlier this week that to be politically correct, we should avoid using the word women when speaking about abortions because it excludes trans men or female to male transsexuals. While discussing media, quote, reaction to Caitlyn Jenner during the June 2nd airing of All In with Chris Hayes, Michael Goldberg, senior contributor writer for The Nation, suggested that using the word women in abortion language excludes trans men. Her statement was prompted by a general agreement among the panelists that younger people can more easily understand a fluid gender, one having no connection to biology." I mean, this is silly. And then it says, quote, well, yeah, I mean, among young people, I've had this conversation, I've written about this, and there are some conflicts, especially within feminism, over these issues, Goldberg said, as a lead-in to her abortion arguments. And then she said, so a lot of younger feminists, for example, at the abortion funds, she said, no longer want to use the word woman in relation to abortion because it excludes trans men. I love it. It's a beautiful thing to witness, isn't it? The implosion of a victimhood politic equivalent of a hyper-red giant. Feminists have cannibalized one-too-many movements that don't specifically align with their agenda, that is gynocentrism, and now they can't even practice their own lingo without appearing as bigots. And I love watching these passive-aggressive bullies now have to walk on the same eggshells they littered Western civilization with for fear of not sounding offensive. They are slipping up more and more often, gentlemen. And this controversy may seem as though it's a relatively new one, but over a decade ago, influential feminists like Germaine Greer were expressing their blatant disgust towards male-to-female transgendered people. And I'm going to read to you a bit of an excerpt from a chapter from her book called Pantomime Dames, in Germaine Greer's book, The Whole Woman. And a link to that is going to be in the description box as well. She said, quote, the only way a man can get rid of healthy genitals is to say that he is convinced that he is a woman. Then another man will remove them, and gladly. In order to justify sex change surgery, a new disorder called gender dysphoria has come into being. The disease has no biological marker. Its presence is discerned by a history of inappropriately gendered behavior, social disability, and affective disorder. Later on, further in the chapter, she says, governments that consist of very few women have hurried to recognize as women men who believe that they are women and have had themselves castrated to prove it, because they see women not as another sex, but as a non-sex. No so-called sex change has ever begged for a uterus and ovaries transplant. If uterus and ovaries transplants were made mandatory for wannabe women, they would disappear overnight. The insistence that man-made women be accepted as women is the institutional expression of the mistaken conviction that women are defective males. The biological truth is the opposite. All biologists know that males are defective females. Though external genitalia are the expression of the chromosomal defect, their removal will not alter the chromosomal fact any more than removal of the tails of puppies will produce a tailless breed. Sex change operations can only be carried out in Swift's Laputa, as Dwight D. Billings and Robert Urban argued in 1982. And so this is an excerpt from that book. It says, transsexualism is a relational process sustained in medical practice and marketed in public testimony. The legitimization, rationalization, and commodification of sex change operations have produced an identity category, the transsexual, for a diverse group of sexual deviants and victims of severe gender role distress. And then Greer continues and she says, as sufferers from gender role distress themselves, women must sympathize with transsexuals, but a feminist must argue that the treatment for gender role distress is not mutilation of the sufferer, but radical change of gender roles. Throughout their history, women who could not carry out the prescribed gender roles have suffered all kinds of ghastly gynecological procedures, and like transsexuals, they have been grateful to their abusers. Women could hardly now condone the elaborate mutilations practiced on individuals of both sexes, even though the victims argue that such mutilations are their right. Now, it's amazing that this woman says that men seeking to become women, I guess you call them male to female transgendered, and the sex change surgeries that they seek would end and cease overnight if they had to be implanted with the female uterus and ovaries. It's incredible that this woman says that as though it's some kind of complaint when her entire grievance industry revolves around women claiming to be equal to men, but not wanting to incur the job deaths, the increased on-the-job deaths, the conscription, the 70-hour overtime work weeks, the equal sentencing under the law. Of course, women like Germaine Greer and women as a whole would stop trying to claim equality with men if they had to incur those things. And Germaine, my dear, if you ever listen to this, you forget that, it is their right. It is a male to female transgendered person's right to undergo this sex change. Millions of women go under the knife and ask for tummy tucks and breast augmentation or vaginal rejuvenation and a myriad of other procedures. They sign a medical document stating they know the risks associated with these surgeries, and then they consent to a trained medical professional cutting into them and essentially mutilating their body in a controlled way so as to furnish a more aesthetically pleasing look. And no, Germaine Greer, not all of these women are doing this to satisfy men. As a matter of fact, webcam girls, for example, get boob jobs because they know that it makes them more money, because they know that they become more demanding and thus they can exploit more men in their business. You don't talk about that, do you? So, the same right that women have to get boob jobs, the same goes for male to female transgenders. Now, we're going to go bit by bit over what she said here. I'm going to repeat the quote in pieces. She says, "The insistence that man-made women be accepted as women is the institutional expression of the mistaken conviction that women are defective males. The biological truth is the opposite. All biologists know that males are defective females." Now, there's just so much stupidity going on here. It's really incredible. All biologists know that males are defective females? Really? Not only is this scientifically incorrect, it's dripping with projection. It's penis envy at its worst. You see, women like Germaine Greer look at a world filled with amazing male accomplishments and they bristle. They hate that men are beautiful. They look at the peafowl and then to the peacock, and they hate his magnificent plumage, ignoring all along that the peafowl evolved to prefer that plumage in the peacock. Germaine Greer looks around at the world's manifestations of male brilliance, their contributions to science, the skylines they've engineered and built in the majority, and she hates men for building them, but knows that her entire comfortable little existence could not be possible without the men that she hates. This is why she, and feminists like her, so vehemently guard against their, quote, femaleness. They understand that men created civilization and the concomitant wonders therein, mostly for the benefit of women, and thus any attempt on the part of men to emulate female sexual appeal is seen as a threat to that benefit. And again, this is why Greer says the following about the uterus. She says, "No so-called sex change has ever begged for a uterus and ovaries transplant. If uterus and ovaries transplants were made mandatory for wannabe women, they would disappear overnight." And this is more projection. What you're witnessing here is the modus operandi of feminists like Germaine Greer. She says, in one sentence, she says, "We aren't our vaginas. We aren't our uterus. Women can do anything that men can do. Gender is a social construct." And in the same rant, she says, well, if men just had a uterus, then they would understand our suffering. This is what I mean when I say that feminism is a toxic form of some of the worst parts of female nature and their tendencies. This is literally the unhappy wife bitching at her husband no matter what he does to please her. It just so happens to be on a scale that encompasses enough people that can be called a type of gendered social contract. Feminists know what side their bread is buttered on, and frankly, so do women, despite the occasional lip service from, anti-feminist women, who themselves consist largely of conservative women who want disposable husbands, or progressive women that think only, quote, modern or third-wave feminism is toxic. Women will continue to support feminism politically in the majority because feminism is simply a state-sponsored manifestation of a part of female nature that is obsessed with her own safety and provision. Now, the male instinct to provide and protect for women is just as much the culprit in this, of course, right? We've talked about male servility here at length, so I don't want this to be misconstrued as solely a problem regarding female nature. This is human nature. It is a tendency of our species to be gynocentric, not of men or of women, but of men and of women. But for this post, however, our analysis is going to concentrate on the relationship between women and the state-sponsored female advocacy movement known as feminism. The funny thing is that when Greer herself saw men trying to replicate the female uterus, right? When they tried to acquire one for their own, that is, when Elton John and his husband, David Furnish, had children via in vitro fertilization, Greer had this to say about it. She said, quote, "Sometimes I think that really the problem is the concept of motherhood, which we can't give any real structure to. Sir Elton John and his, quote, wife, David Furnish, have entered on a birth certificate of their two sons that David Furnish is the mother. I'm sorry, That will give you an idea of how the concept of motherhood has emptied out. It's gone. It's been deconstructed. Well, Miss Greer, when you affix your entire identity to your vagina, that's what tends to happen when a bunch of clever men start inventing techniques to replace the function of your vagina and your uterus. Okay? Either way, this is all incorrect. David Furnish, Elton John's husband, did not ask to be cited as the, quote, mother on the birth certificate. The law instead allowed for him to be listed simply as parent, along with Elton John. Gender never came into the picture. But her reaction to the mistaken title of mother speaks volumes. She doesn't want the domain of womankind, the Promethean fire of the womb, to be in the hands of men, especially gay men, since of course they tend not to be able to be sexually manipulated by women. The not-so-distant future holds the promise of the complete separation of humanity from our original forms of reproduction for those that want it that way. Ectogenesis, artificial wombs, and perhaps the correct manipulation of primordial germ cells will make it so that anyone can reproduce with anyone else. Feminists, don't worry. Eventually, you're going to get your post-gender society. You might want to be careful what you're wishing for, though, right? Feminists have, again, I've talked about this before, a history of opposing the artificial womb. I'm going to repeat to you a quote I mentioned in a previous video from the famed and infamous feminist Andrea Dworkin, who makes clear in her book titled, quote, Right-Wing Woman, about how she feels about the development of a means of artificial reproduction, or an artificial uterus. She writes, quote, reproductive technology is now changing the terms on which men control reproduction. The social control of women who reproduce, the sloppy, messy kind of control, is being replaced by medical control much more precise, much closer to the efficiency of the brothel model. This changeover, applying the brothel model to reproduction, is just beginning. It is beyond the scope of this book to explore or explain all the new technological intrusions into conception, gestation, and birth, except to say that reproduction will become the kind of commodity that sex is now. Artificial insemination, in vitro fertilization, sex selection, genetic engineering, fetal monitoring, artificial wombs that keep the fetus alive outside of the mother's body, fetal surgery, embryo transplants, and eventual cloning. All these reproductive intrusions make the womb the province of the doctor, not the woman. All make the womb extractable from the woman as a whole person in the same way the vagina or sex is now. Some make the womb extraneous altogether or eventually extraneous. All make reproduction controllable by men on a scale heretofore unimaginable. And don't you hate that, Dworkin? The issue is not the particular innovation itself, whether it is intrinsically good or bad. The issue is how it will be used in a system in which women are sexual and reproductive commodities already exploited with lives that are worthless when not serving a specific sexual or reproductive purpose. Oh, poor dear, Andrea Dworkin. She continues down the line and says, the ideology of male control of reproduction will stay what it is. The hatred of women will stay what it is. What will change will be the means of expressing both the ideology and the hatred. The means will give conception, gestation, and birth over to men. Eventually, the whole process of the creation of life will be in their hands. And see, this is what terrifies feminists. This is what terrifies feminists. You know that your trump card is slowly but surely going to be ripped away from you. And of course, we're not going to stop women from being able to do it the old-fashioned way, or men from being able to do it the old-fashioned way. So what are you afraid of? She says, again, I'm going to repeat this part. The new means will enable men at last really to have women for sex and women for reproduction, both controlled with sadistic precision by men, end quote. You see, radical feminists like Dworkin actually understand feminism quite well. They have no pretenses, they jealously guard female power, whilst using a victim narrative to attack all forms of male power. This is a power struggle, and feminism is designed, as I've said, as a perpetual female advocacy machine dedicated towards increasing female power. And this is why the prospect of men obtaining an alternative method of reproduction scares her. She knows, clearly, that the power to incubate human life is an immense power, and a tactician such as myself understands that it must be obtained for men. To be clear, I will explain exactly what I'm proposing here. The technology must be developed so that men can, if they so choose, reproduce without women. The ability for humanity to reproduce the old-fashioned way will remain, but another option will be present, one that men, whether they are heterosexual or homosexual, can take. This, along with male contraception, will go a very long way in remedying the damage that feminism has done. So now then, with all of that said, I will attempt to put forth an explanation of what feminism is and does from an evolutionary perspective. Now, anyone who has studied feminism in any detail knows that while they tend to agree on several core tenets, the wage gap or the all-encompassing miasma of patriarchy theory, the various subfactions of feminism are far from acting in unison. I do not like the term radical feminist because in some form or another, feminists of all stripes elicit extremism toward the male sex deserving of the word. But for the sake of distinction, I will note that, quote, radical feminists often bicker with, quote, sex-positive feminists and, other less than, I guess you could say, sapphic manifestations of gynocentric feminism, accusing them of veiled capitulation to the male sex drive for their less than prudish attitudes towards the safeguarding of female sexuality. The truth is, of course, that while radical feminists prefer a type of perpetual lysistrata against the male sex, sex-positive feminists go the hypersexual route. Both camps generally seek the same goal. That is the manipulation of men via female sexuality. The, quote, radicals, on a subconscious level, seek to attack the male sex by rousing the unofficial sisterhood into manufacturing sexual scarcity, either through encouraging women to pursue lesbian relationships, and, there's nothing wrong with lesbian relationships, by the way, but I'm just saying, or via the further criminalization of the male sex, as we've seen with their attempts to constantly move the goalpost that defines things like consent, or sexual assault, or domestic violence. Here are some of the examples of how this dynamic can work. Let's first tackle the notion of the age of consent. Age of consent, the concept behind it is pretty fascinating, I think, because it attempts to give a standard age to which adulthood is intangibly conferred. In order to understand the age of consent, we have to understand its biological origins. An analysis of the life expectancy of human beings from the late Paleolithic and early Neolithic era gives us the following. And this is going to be just a chart of life expectancy here. And that's going to be in the description box if you want to see that. For a very long period, the average life expectancy was only about 3 decades or so. And this chart neglects to factor in infant and child mortality, and thus the figures we see aren't completely accurate since they are being driven down by the deaths of infants and young children. There are also studies that correct for infant mortality, showing that in the environment we evolved in, the human being has an approximate, quote, natural lifespan of about 70 years. And one such study looked at the lifespans of current existing hunter-gatherer tribes and came to the following conclusions. They said, quote, our conclusion is that there is a characteristic lifespan for our species in which mortality decreases sharply from infancy through childhood, followed by a period in which mortality rates remain essentially constant to about age 40 years, after which mortality rises steadily in Gompertz fashion. The model age of adult death is about 7 decades, before which time humans remain vigorous producers, and after which senescence rapidly occurs and people die. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that word correctly. I'm assuming it's some sort of derivative of the word senile. But anyway, it says, we hypothesize that human bodies are designed to function well for about 7 decades in the environment in which our species evolved. Mortality rates differ among populations and among periods, especially in risks of violent death. However, those differences are small in comparative cross-species perspective. And the similarity in mortality profiles of traditional peoples living in varying environments is impressive. Later on, it says, infant mortality is over 30 times greater among hunter-gatherers, and early child mortality is over 100 times greater than encountered in the United States. We see that on average, 57%, 64%, and 67% of children born survive to age 15 years among hunter-gatherers, forager horticulturalists, and acculturated hunter-gatherers. End quote. So then, while I admit, all of this to be mere speculation on my part more than anything else, But I would wager that it became important in Paleolithic and Neolithic tribes and societies, given the high rates of child and infant mortality, to try to reproduce as early as possible in order to produce enough children that would make it through the period of attrition to the age of about 15, where mortality rates dropped significantly. This, I would assume, was the only way that a group of people, a roving band of people, could amass enough persons to build the first Paleolithic tribes. I would assume that the most populous bands and tribes of humans in the early Paleolithic, that is, the tribes that were able to breed enough to get the largest numbers of people past these vulnerable ages, were the first to develop enough spare time, given that more people could then acquire more resources, to develop and explore the concept of leisure. The more one could dedicate towards acquiring food, the more likely it was that one of our more observant ancestors could have flirted with the abstract concepts of things like ritual burial, or contemplation of the afterlife, or fire by friction. And so this created an incentive to start breeding as early as possible. It should be of no surprise then that the historical age of consent has traditionally been very close to the age in which puberty occurs. As you know, if you're familiar with my content, I again forward the hypothesis that feminism is in actuality a result not of some salivating misandrists concocting schemes in their ivory towers against men, but instead of fixed human nature and reproductive tendencies reacting to the changing environment of the Industrial Revolution. Given that the human species is one of sexual dimorphism, we can assume that there are methods of sexual selection taking place in the human species that are emergent in scale. There is the interspecies struggle, the struggle against the elements and, against other species that human beings have fought against for countless millennia, culminating eventually in our dominance of the planet. And there is then the presence of an intra-species struggle. I've talked about this before. That is, a struggle within the species between individuals. In this case, for our purposes, the two sides of our sexual dimorphism, males and females, known traditionally as the battle of the sexes. We are the first species on this planet to have had achieved the advanced sentience that allows for an understanding of one's own mechanisms of reproduction. We know that our species is locked in an embrace of mutual exploitation. Women want resources and protection from men. Men want sexual access from women. The resulting institutions we've erected, marriage included, are simple manifestations of the compromises men and women have devised to address this dynamic in a somewhat reasonable way. But make no mistake about it, both men and women seek to minimize what they give and maximize what they get. Men do not wish to part with their resources in exchange for sexual access, so they devise ways to minimize the evolutionary tariff demanded of them by women. Many a man has used the promise of resources, whether those resources exist or not, to gain access to sex. And the age-old practice of men exaggerating their wealth or status in order to convince a woman to give up the goods is well documented. It is the human male equivalent of mating plumage, an intelligent primate's rendition of the azuline grottos the male bowerbird is famous for offering up to his mate. The industrious bowerbird, however, having not the intelligence to understand what it is doing, simply goes about picking bits of blue scraps to adorn his nest with. It never occurs to him to cheat and find an easier way to amass blue trinkets to adorn his nest with in order to trick the female into equating his ill-gotten bits of blue with reproductive fitness. It never occurs to him because a bird, of course, is not intelligent enough to know that his ability to collect blue items to adorn his nest with is directly correlated to his reproductive fitness. He is simply unconsciously collecting blue items because he knows on an instinctual level, not on a cognizant level or a sentient level, that it will lead to sexual access. The human ape, however, can understand that a fancy car or an expensive home or a Rolex watch is correlated, in fact, to his reproductive fitness by women. Now, an earlier post titled, on Shedding of the Ego, titled, "If You Lie to Get Sex, Go to Jail," I illustrated a microcosm of this dynamic, right? And here are the important bits of the article I linked to. The article says, quote, "Lying to get sex has been going on since Adam ate the proverbial apple. It will never stop, but wouldn't it be great if there was somewhere that a burned lover could turn to if she discovered that the man who told her he was childless not only had a 10-year-old, but also a pregnant side John? Or if the person they're sleeping with showed them photos of a beautiful home he claimed to own, but in reality was living in his parents' basements. In other words, wouldn't it be great if a woman duped into having sex could have the jerk arrested? Absolutely, says Michelle Lewis, the 37-year-old suburban mom turned activist, is the inspiration behind a New Jersey bill that would make sexual assault by deception a crime, end quote. And then the article continues later down and says, I know this is going to make some readers livid, but stay with me. Introduced late last year by Assemblyman Troy Singleton, that's a Democrat, Burlington, it says D. Burlington, the bill would make sexual assault by fraud a punishable offense. The bill defines it as an act of sexual penetration to which a person has given a consent because the actor has misrepresented the purpose of the act or has represented he is someone he is not, end quote. Yes, you read that right. A suburban mom, quote, turned activist is attempting to compel lawmakers to make lying in order to acquire consent to sex a crime. Further down in the article, it says this. As Yale professor Jed Rubenfield wrote in a 2013 edition of the Yale Law Review, quote, rape by deception is almost universally rejected in American criminal law. But if rape is sex without the victim's consent, as many courts, state statutes, and scholars say it is, then sex by deception ought to be rape. Because as courts have held for 100 years in virtually every area of the law outside of a rape, a consent procured through deception is no consent at all. So, I suppose that, every woman I've slept with that has ever applied manicured nails or a padded bra or a pair of high heels has, quote, lied to me about her reproductive fitness, hasn't she? I suppose every woman that has knowingly committed paternity fraud should be jailed as well under this logic, right? And yet women and feminists will never be seen lobbying lawmakers to punish that as a crime. Why? Well, if we're safe in assuming that the advent of civilization and along with it, the development of systems of law and jurisprudence did nothing to dispel, this intra-species competition that we have, this war, this battle of the sexes, then it makes perfect sense. It is not evolutionarily advantageous for women to seek to persecute paternity fraud, thus it tends not to happen. But it is, however, advantageous to, after having had acquired suffrage, for women to agitate for laws that make it harder for men to get sex on the cheap via a bit of subterfuge. So, gentlemen, that's all that I really have to say for now. More content coming soon. Thanks for listening.